I'm not sure we need a mic. Do we need a mic?
No.
Probably not. You can complain if you can't hear me. Yeah, that was a very good introduction to next subject, which is mining. Because what happens is the nomads get shifted off the land, and the next thing that happens is the mining companies move in, or dam building companies, or both, actually. And in some cases, the Chinese have had the goal to declare these areas national parks before they move the nomads in, and then the mining moves in. It's kind of like paper parks that they do. Anyway, I wrote a book based on some documentaries, which is this one, and it's covering a lot of different things like the mining, the nomads, and the dams and diversion, various things there. But today I just want to look at the mining because that's the big thing that's coming up next, and it's going to be accelerated. By the way, we're selling these copies later if you want to have a look at one. It's going to be accelerated because of the railway. The railways arrived in Lhasa 2006, but they're expanding the railway, so it's going west to Shigatse. It's already reached Shigatse. If you're familiar with Tibet, the mining is sort of in different valleys, but one of the biggest mining areas is in the eastern side of Tibet, around Gyama, a big copper mine, and the railway is heading in that direction to Ningxi. So once the railway gets there, that's really going to accelerate the exploitation of Tibet. So what I was going to do, we're going to show a movie about mining, which is one that I made myself, but not yet. But the way the movie's put together, it's impossible to visit these mines. You can't go in there and just take photographs and wander around. You'll never get within 50 kilometers of one of these mines, you know. They're kind of hidden down valleys, they're off the road. So the only way you can do it, which is what we did, is to use Google Earth.
That's electric.
Wait a minute. Don't start that yet. So it's a little bit boring in places because it's Google Earth flyovers, but that's the only way you get the footage. You can't get to these mines any other way. But then from the aerial perspective, you can see how big the mines are. You can see how much potential damage there is. So the damage to the environment is going to be enormous because China has very little in the way of safety standards, very little in the way of environmental impact assessment, what these mines are going to do to the rivers. So you start thinking about the rivers and the mines together because the power for the mines comes from the dams that they're building on these rivers. The latest one's on the Yalang Sampo, which is in the same area as Gyama. There's only one reason to build a dam there. There's hardly any population at all. There's only one reason to build a dam, and that's to power the mines. No other reason I can think of. Unless you set up an industrial base, and you also there's no industrial base. So what's going to happen is that these mines, which are close to rivers, major rivers, are going to pollute those rivers. And then that's already happening in Tibet itself. But what happens downstream? Downstream, if eventually it's going to flow into other countries. It hasn't happened yet because these rivers are very long. The pollution will dissipate. But it certainly has happened in Tibet. There have been cases where there's one case in the eastern Tibet where a lot of fish died in the river from some sort of pollutant, and the locals took big loads of this fish to City Hall, and the immediate response is to bring out the troops. That was the protest, but if it's killing the fish, there's got to be something seriously wrong going on in that river. That's not the only place it's happened. It's happened in various places in China as well. If you've been reading your press, China is not exactly world's #1 for environmental records. So, unfortunately, Tibet has huge deposits of valuable minerals that China wants. And I just look at two examples. One would be lithium, which is in batteries, cell phone batteries, camera batteries, just about any kind of battery these days has lithium. And that is, it's a huge resource in Tibet, in the west, and in Qinghai. So that alone is worth the trouble of exploiting that material alone, because it's so valuable, it's so hard to get. And also China imports that from Chile and Bolivia. They bring it in because they can't get enough. But the other, the other minerals that are in Tibet, there's a lot of oil in Qinghai. They've been taking out oil, millions of barrels of oil, over a period of 20, 30, 40 years. But they're discovering a whole lot more oil. And what they're discovering now is rather alarming because it's shale oil, and also shale gas, and then tar sands oil. And I don't know if you're familiar with what's happened in tar sands in Western Canada, in Alberta, because I'm from Canada. It's probably the worst destruction you can ever see to a landscape is what happens when they do tar sands extraction. It's horrendous. And if they apply that in Qinghai, they'll do exactly the same thing. So there's a side-down basin that's been a mining area for more than 50 years. It's like a wasteland. That's northwest Qinghai. So if you go in there, we got a section in this film actually. There was a Norwegian photographer who was on the ground, and he got some photographs of an asbestos mine in the side-down basin. Side-down basin has been exploited for more than 50 years for oil, all kinds of minerals. So it's not like a picture of what's going to happen in Tibet in 10 or 15 years. And you know, asbestos is such a deadly substance that it's been banned in many countries. They're not allowed to use it in construction. It used to be okay, but then they found out it was causing cancer. But in this, the pictures that he took, the only protection that the miners had was like a face mask. That was it, which is no protection against asbestos whatsoever. So they're working out in the open, and the asbestos is just floating around like this. If that's their safety standards, you know, you got to wonder that, you know, what the rest of their mining is like. It's very, very difficult to get mining pictures of any sort. What I was planning to do was to show a short film. It's about 20 minutes on mining, and then we'll have some time for question and answer after that. But before we do that, who has been to Tibet? Anybody been to Tibet? No. And maybe you won't want to go after you see this. Well, it's kind of sad because, you know, when I first got there, it was back in the 80s. The place was still pretty pristine. There was no mining going on. There was no railway, one thing, and there was very little damming going on. There was some, but it was on the eastern edges. So unfortunately, I've seen it when it was still fairly pristine, and it's a beautiful place. I mean, you get fantastic snow caps, beautiful grasslands, and all of that is now under threat. And you think, well, how can that change? It's mountains. You can't destroy a mountain, but you can destroy a mountain. If you start digging away at the mountain and mining, you're going to destroy the mountain. And unfortunately, China is involved in a technology now they use in central China called mountaintop removal, where they take the whole top off the mountain. They're trying to level it so they can use it for agriculture. And they're not doing that in Tibet, but to get at the minerals, just to give an example for copper, they might find a copper seam in a mountain. For 1 ton of rock, they'll only get 1% copper. So they have to destroy 99% of that rock to get that 1%. So it's enormous devastation that would go on if they're after the copper, or the gold, or the silver that's in those seams. And also, it's going to damage the grasslands. Probably a third of Tibet would be grasslands. And if you start digging up for mining, a couple of things happen. One thing is you open it up for dust. There's a lot of wind going through. So the dust just comes barreling through, and you've lost your grasslands. You know, I mean, the Chinese are accusing the nomads of causing these problems with the grasslands and relocating them, but actually what's happening is the mining is causing the problems. Mining and fencing are two big things that have caused the problem. So the Chinese will try and place the blame on the nomads for the degradation of the grasslands, but that is not the case. Nomads have been there for 4,000 years. They've been looking after these grasslands and know what to do to keep them healthy. And if you want to pin the blame on grassland degradation, it would have to be mining, would be the biggest one. But unfortunately, also the mining is happening in national parks, or where it's not supposed to be happening. And this is employed by China to, it works quite successfully, and convinced a lot of Western nations that these are real national parks, but they're not. You know, they declare the place a national park, move the nomads out, and then 2 months later, in comes a mining company. So how does that work? You know, it wouldn't work in the West. You couldn't do that. We're also building a dam within the confines of the national park. And you'll see some brochures in Chinese. They say that the river is in good enough condition that we can dam it. You know, the logic is kind of weird. You know, I can't think of any Western national park that has a dam sitting in the middle of it. And maybe it exists, but maybe the dam was there first, before they declared it a national park. In this case, they'll declare it a national park and the dam comes in after. They've done that a few times. Actually, there's a World Heritage Site, 3 parallel rivers, was declared a World Heritage Site, and then they started damming it after that, after it was declared a site like that. So I'm not sure what the logic is there, but it's certainly, their idea of a national park is nowhere near what a Western idea of a national park should be. But anyway, so what we're going to do is we're going to screen the film, and then we're going to be open up for question and answer, probably about 10 or 15 minutes at least. So hopefully you get lots of questions from the film. But I should warn you that a lot of it's Google Earth images, which does tend to get a little bit slow. It's not an action film. It's kind of slow. That's because we had no other source to get the material from. If you want to do a movie about mining Tibet, you can interview mining engineers, I guess, but couldn't do that. And very few mining authorities amongst the Tibetans themselves, because they don't know anything about mining, because they haven't done it themselves. And in their history, they would leave the land alone. They would not mine it, because, well, as you some reason explain it here, digging was frowned upon in all Tibet, because it's disturbing the spirits in the land. And also, with Bon religion, the ancient religion of Tibet, it was animist, so you weren't supposed to dig up anything, you weren't supposed to disturb the lakes, you weren't supposed to cut down trees, things like this. A lot of it was based on animism, not so much Tibetan Buddhism, but more animism. Anyway, we'll start the film. And
who
yes.
actually is the labour force? Is that Chinese or is it Tibetan?
For the mines?
For the mines, yeah.
Always Chinese. I can't think of any place where it's got any Tibetan engineers or any even Tibetan workers. I have heard of Tibetan drivers that drive the miners to work and back. I've heard of that. But I've never heard of any Tibetan workers, and I've never seen any pictures of Tibetan workers. And the other thing is that Tibetans get no royalties, they get no benefits, nothing from these mines. And furthermore, all of the mining is exported probably. It's going back to mainland China. It's not consumed within Tibet. So they get nothing. It's a curious case because I think when China went into, I think it was Peru, they promised the locals royalties and all kinds of benefits and then community halls and they'll do this, that and that just to get the contracts. But they never offer any of that in Tibet itself, They just ignore Tibetans because it belongs to them. So why should they offer anything? They don't have to. But if they go into another country, like they're doing lots of mining things in Burma, Africa, the mining that China does, it's actually around the world, but their ethical standards are very, very low, and they've had problems in places like Africa, where they've been attacked, because people revolt against what's happening, But even there, even in Africa, they're still using Chinese miners. Why do they bring in miners all the way from China to Africa when they could use African workers who need to work, right? But the thing is, they don't trust them, for one thing. I don't know what they're doing in Peru. Maybe they're employing Peruvians. But it's their policy, usually with building dams or anything like this. There's a case in Burma where they got a big copper mine, Duang, in the northern side of Burma. They have a lot of trouble now because the locals didn't like it. And they held a big protest, and the military came in and vanquished them, and they used phosphorus bombs, which is military-grade weapons, and people got burned and all kinds of stuff. So it was the Burmese military in cahoots with the Chinese military. There's Chinese military on the ground as well. And then, after that, things died down a little bit, and they went back to normal. They're still exploiting the mine. But recently, they've tried to expand that mine, which means that more people get shifted out. So there's another protest, and the pictures you saw was of Burmese military ringing the whole thing to protect the site from the locals who didn't like it. And it's the biggest copper mine in Burma. And all of that stuff is probably going across the border back into China. It's not going to stay in Burma. So, and I believe that most of the miners are Chinese. Well, it's hard to verify that. But that's the way they operate, So the ethics are not that great. And of course in Tibet, they don't have to worry about any of this because Tibet technically belongs to them. But Tibetans who have protested against mining, and there's been a number of protests, sometimes they end up in jail for 5 years, 10 years. They might get shot, they might disappear. So they pay a heavy price for protesting. At least in Burma they can protest and get away with it, not in Tibet. What I mean is get away with it. It's being observed by other people, and there's photographs and things are going on. That doesn't happen in Tibet at all. But there is one section in the film where we got some cell phone footage that was smuggled out over protests. And you can see what happens. There's no attempt to negotiate or anything, it's just military comes in and clears out the protest. And in the protest you actually see the protesters used the words of the president, Xi Jinping, on a poster saying that he would preserve the environment and this is a national park, and they just ripped it down, you know. They're not even following what their leader said. But actually this is within the confines of the national park. So their objection was, well, you declared it a national park and now you're bringing in miners, so what's happening? So anyway, I'm going to show the film. Hopefully that projector works.